Now, if you've been with us for the last few weeks, you'll know that generally we have been following this year through the book of Luke. If you're new, Luke is a book in the Bible that tells the story of Jesus, and it is a good one. I often think if people are wondering where would you start if you wanted to find out about Jesus, where would you start if you were reading the Bible for the first time? Luke is a great place to start. And so that's where we are today, and we are reading a story that Jesus told. Here we go. Jesus told the story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a despised tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer: I thank you, God, that I'm not like other people, cheaters, sinners, adulterers. I'm certainly not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give you 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, Oh God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner. I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned to his home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Here we have a situation that was probably highly unlikely, and that is because we've got a very religious man going to the temple, which you'd expect, but you've also got someone who was loathed by his fellow Israelites, by the fellow Jews, because he was betraying them. At the time, Israel was occupied by the Roman army as part of the Roman Empire, and the Romans extracted quite a heavy tax on all the people in the Roman Empire, and they were loathed because of that. But the tax collectors were from among the people, so it was a fellow Jew who sided with the oppressor and took and collected the tax to hand over to the Romans. Not only that, they generally inflated the prices to make themselves very wealthy while doing it. And the Romans didn't care so long as they were getting their take. And so here's a person who's just hated by their fellow Jews. They're cheating people out of money, they're stealing, they're extorting people, they've sided with the oppressor, and they probably wouldn't likely be showing up to the temple when there's many other people around because they would be so frowned on and looked down on. And so here is who we meet in the temple in Jesus' story, a very religious person, and the opposite, someone who has sort of turned his back on his fellow people in order to get rich. And I think it's really a story about different types of doing wrong, or what the Bible often calls sin. Because here in the story you can look at that tax collector who's just got zero morals, who is taking money off, siding with the oppressor. There's nothing good about him. And it's very easy to go and to identify, this is all the things wrong with this person. With the way Jesus tells the story, we can see all the things wrong with the religious person. But I think in everyday life, there are people not necessarily religious in our culture, but people that we look up to. And we're like, look at that person, aren't they amazing? And we tend to turn a blind eye to all the things going on in their lives that, are actually hidden but still pretty dodgy. I was thinking as I was writing this about the traditional 7 deadly sins. And they're not from the Bible, but they are sort of traditions in the church where people talk about, the 7 sins that lead to death, or the 7 deadly sins. And when you look at them, I actually think there's a lot that are praised in our culture. And if you look at who we esteem, who we look up to, they've just got these traits on display. Greed. Wealthy people that have billions of dollars that they will never be able to spend on themselves. Just making themselves richer and richer and richer. And we hold them up often as heroes. Pride. When you think of some of the people on social media and the way they're kind of flaunting their beauty, their wealth, their esteem, their popularity. Our culture is all in on that, and so on. And so this story of the Pharisee, the tax collector, people could identify there was one person who'd done bad stuff, but not necessarily identify in the other person what was going wrong there. And it's a lesson for all of us. It's really easy to look at other people and go, look at the mess their lives are in. Look at the stupid beliefs they've got. Look at the way they vote that I don't. Look how they support such and such a cause. It's easy to do that, and it's convenient to do that. It's much harder to look inside and go, what have I got going on that's not so great? So this is a challenge from this passage. The challenge to actually look inside our own hearts and say, where am I going off track that I might not even notice because our culture completely praises these traits? There's something else happening in these passages that I noticed a few authors writing about this week. So I've got a few quotes coming up because they were really good and I didn't think I could word it better myself. So you're going to hear their words, not mine. But I came across this Lutheran minister from the United States. His name is Peter Marty. And he comments on this and pulls something out of the passage, which I think is super interesting. He says this: the Pharisees' stance is related to a phenomenon in our own day called virtue signalling. It's a mostly pejorative term applied to those eager to advertise their own righteousness. In a bid for praise, often disguised beneath expressions of indignation and moral outrage, signallers indicate just how kind and decent they are. Social media fosters this particular form of vanity because broadcasting personal virtue is right at home on such platforms. So just in case we need a bit of a reminder, what is virtue signalling exactly? Here's a bit of definition. Popular modern habit of indicating that one has virtue merely by expressing disgust or favour for certain political ideas or cultural happenings. And here's some examples of virtue signalling. A person sharing a status or photo on social media in support of an in the news cause because they want to show others that they're a good person. Or a person wearing a t-shirt showing that they donated money to some cause because they want others to think that they're charitable. Or a company saying that they'll change an issue in their terms of service following a public controversy because they want to improve their public image. There is a problem with this phenomenon in our culture. And the problem often is that we might want to advertise we're a good person, but advertising that you're a good person doesn't necessarily make you a good person at all. Putting a post on Facebook, showing a link, and these are things I've done, a link to a cause that you believe in doesn't actually make me better than someone who doesn't do that, or actually necessarily better as a person. Peter Marty goes on, it's one thing to want to be good, to lead a virtuous life, to stand behind moral values of consequence. It's altogether another to want other people to know just how good we are. Herein lies the danger of virtue signalling. It's mostly talk. Signallers can trumpet their outrage or their anger or indicate support for fashionable causes, all without obligating themselves to any substantive action that might bring more hope and healing to the world. To portray yourself as virtuous, you don't have to be virtuous. You don't have to do anything to change the world. You could put up a post, about poverty, but not donate a cent towards people in need. You could put a post up about, a cause that's fighting racism, but not do anything in your own life to challenge structures practically. And so here is a bit of a challenge. But then he goes on, and I think this is another thing that really hits home, as if there hasn't been enough, pointing out how bad it is. And this signalling relies on criticising others, implicitly or explicitly, in order to boost one's own image by comparison. I think this is where it begins to hit home. Often when people post, or let's face it, in real life, because it isn't just online, there's a lot of kind of critique. I think online fosters it a lot more than it ever used to be. When you go, and I am one of those suckers, I do go and read comments under news articles. People are just vicious in some of their comments. They cut people down. They think the worst of people's motives. They write people off as either completely good or completely evil. It just creates this very black and white, narrow view of the world. And people might be writing, about the politicians they hate at the moment, about what terrible people they are. But the reality is it's not bringing any healing or hope to the world by doing that. And this is the challenge. How do we do that? Criticising someone who has power, criticising someone who thinks differently from us is not necessarily going to change anything, and it might, in fact, make things worse. So this is some of the challenges with it. I was reading a blog post on this by someone called, I need to look at his name, it's on the other page, Chad Gradsdale. He says this: virtue signalling substitutes performance for virtue. Now, all virtue is performed to some degree or another. It is no virtue to claim to care about the poor without actually taking steps to care about the poor. But herein lies the problem with virtue signalling. It substitutes a public performance for an actual demonstration of virtue. Social media in particular seduces us into a type of false efficacy. We think that we're accomplishing something in our tweets, but in the overwhelming number of cases, we aren't actually doing anything more than posturing. James, which is a book in the Bible, James gives us a scenario in James chapter 2 of someone encountering a person who is hungry and in need of clothes. A person who responds, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," hasn't actually been virtuous. He has simply acknowledged the difficulty of the situation by offering a platitude. I would argue that the hypothetical person of James 2 is guilty of virtue signalling. Here is a social problem. I publicly acknowledge the social problem. Therefore, I am virtuous. Don't misunderstand. There is something to be said for raising public awareness of an issue. I'm just not convinced that raising awareness should be counted among the virtues. Virtue should cost us something. Changing the filter on our Facebook profile picture or adopting the latest trending hashtag on Twitter, you can tell this is old, doesn't really cost us anything, and it also doesn't really accomplish much of anything other than signalling our virtue. Quite hard-hitting, but here's the culture that we're living in. We're not really discussing often the morality of this social world that we inhabit and how we might actually find our way amongst it. Now, if you're sitting listening to this, you might have noticed there's a flaw in this argument. And that is, if you critique someone who's virtue signalling, are you yourself virtue signalling? Like, look at that person. They're only doing that, to virtue signal. You've just done the same yourself. And here is, I think this is back to Peter Marty. Publicly accusing someone of virtue signalling carries its own problems. Accusers who are unwilling to identify with legitimate concerns or interests that matter to the signaller might be doing nothing more than levelling cheap criticism and displaying their own self-righteousness. We're in a trap here. How on earth do we navigate this world if we, notice someone else is saying something bad on Facebook, but we point that out? Is that just making ourselves look good? What do we do here? Came across this great cartoon. Here's Jesus. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to. Hang on. Paul, am I virtue signalling here? Are you what? Virtue signalling. It's like this whole thing right now. What, you mean when you climb on a rock and tell everyone to be good like you are? Yeah, that. You do that? Yeah. I might stop it then. Thing is, I don't think we want Jesus to stop telling us what virtues to live. Jesus was the perfect human. The challenge is when we imagine that we are Jesus, like Jesus was challenging people, he was throwing down the challenges left, right and centre, and I'm going to do the same. How do we do that, though, without falling into this trap that Jesus talks about in this parable, that we're putting on display for everybody, that we've got the right beliefs? This is tricky. This is what we have to wrestle with and try and figure out in our day. How do we stop becoming the arrogant person who knows everything and always has it right. So here's some helpful hints from social media itself. How to avoid virtue signalling. Ask yourself, am I saying, doing, posting this only to display my good moral values to others? That's the first check. Reflect. Are you posting, for example, an image to social media and then moving on with your day? Or are you taking steps to make real change offline? And then be honest. Do you actually care about the issues you're posting about? Or are you feeling external pressure to post something because everybody else is? The way to overcome virtue signalling isn't to virtue signal some more by pointing out how others do it more than we do. The way to overcome virtue signalling is honest self-reflection. What really are my motivations? The humility and restraint that should accompany sanctification. Sanctification is a big word that means becoming holy, becoming right. So what the humility and restraint that should accompany sanctification, do I have to say something about everything? Do I really understand this issue, or is this person, as well as I need to before saying something? As well as accountability from those who truly know you well enough. Am I blind to my own motivations such that I need to hear the voices of others whom I know I can trust? Now this, I think, is pretty limited when it's only talking about social media, because most of us probably aren't in that space. But we're living in a world where these values are being translated into everyday life, where we are being encouraged to portray a picture or an image of ourselves that is pretty good. And I think that I've noticed a change in the last 20 or so years. Back when I was a young adult, we could talk pretty honestly and brutally about what was going wrong in our lives. Quite, I think, self-depreciating. This is the way I'm a mess. And I don't know if this is a particularly Generation X thing. People often talk about very depressed personalities, not rosy, sad. But now I've noticed that there is this change, as young people coming through now, of a real desire to not go deep, to not talk about what's really going on, to portray this kind of quite shallow existence, that everything's fine. And when I've pushed, I've realised it's not that people are hiding, it's just that culture has not encouraged people to actually look and identify where it's going wrong. People may actually have no idea where they're doing things that are annoying or, hurting other people, because we live in a culture where we're not encouraged to really look deep. What are my flaws? How do I need to change? In history, for most of history, there have been people or philosophers that have encouraged people become a better person. And people will fast, they'll pray, they'll change behaviour, in order to become a better person. They'll be generous. In our day and age, I don't think that's there anymore, that theme that runs through. This is how you become a better person. Really, it's just this competition of being able to say, I am a good person. I'm already a good person, and all I need to do is convince the world of that fact. I think we are going a bit haywire when we think like this. But the problem is, if you look at this final sentence, do I need to hear the voices of those whom I know I can trust? Who actually wants to do that? Do you want to go up to your friends and say, tell me everything that's wrong with me? I'm ready to hear it. I remember actually once doing that to a friend, and they were like, okay, Carolyn, you're too intense. I'm like, fair call. But and then who wants to be on the receiving end of that? Who wants their friend to come up to them and say, hey, let me know everything that's wrong? It's a trap. What do I say here? I've got to think of something really safe that's not going to offend them too much. This could be the end of the friendship if I say the wrong thing here. We're not really in a culture where this works. So when I was thinking, who might be able to do this? Siblings, if you have them. Parents, maybe, depends how helicopter parenty they are. And also that might be quite hurtful, so maybe not. Children, if you have them, I'm sure, would be happy to offer some honest and frank feedback on how you're going. A spouse or partner, if you have one. But I think beyond that, I'm like, I don't want to cause haywire where you're going and asking your friends during the week to critique you and you lose your friends. There's a real risk. But there is this, need, to actually figure out, where am I being, promoting myself like a great person when I'm not actually addressing what's going wrong in my life? When I'm just looking at the other person across the room thinking, at least I'm not like them. What I want to do now is just have a moment of quiet. Because if you can't think of anyone to ask for frank feedback, you can generally ask God, but you need to give a long amount of quiet probably to hear what might be said. And then to also hear that in the midst of that, God's arms are open wide to offer healing and forgiveness. God meets us with grace, which means undeserved kindness. So if we're brave enough to say to God, where is it that I need to change? Know that God is there with arms open wide, wanting to welcome you home and wanting to offer forgiveness. So if we just for a moment, if you feel comfortable, just close your eyes where you are. I want to read a quote from a minister called Joanne Post. And then I'll pray. Jesus applauds the tax collector, the sinner who knows his need. Jesus declares him justified, even though the tax collector will soon go back to his corrupt ways. And even though he does not have the courage to seek God's face. But God sees him anyway. The Pharisee is also seen, though it's not God's eye he wants to catch. His performance in the temple is not prayer, but promotion. He doesn't ask God for anything. He is right with himself. And as Jesus says, he already has his reward. Let's pray. God, you see us. You see us when we come humbly before you, when we ask for your mercy, when we beg for your forgiveness. You see us and you promise forgiveness. God, in a culture where we're encouraged to hide our weakness, to hide our flaws, even from ourselves. Help us to be courageous and brave before you. So God, in this space, I pray that you would speak to us. May we know your empowering courage to face dark corners we might not want to go to. But most of all, God, may we know your love, your grace, your mercy, your kindness, that it doesn't matter what we have done wrong, you are there to offer forgiveness. So wherever we are, God, may we come humbly into your presence. May we be found in your love.